Right. Welcome, people. Good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Welcome to our fifth and final main class of the Crushing Made Simple mentorship. Time really flew last few weeks, and we have arrived at our final week where we're going to complete our discussion on how to retain information advantage. And today we have our main class about how to stay one step ahead. Pretty sure my opponents already adjusted and am crushing me. Really? Is that a joke or are you serious? Because that sounds a little fast. But we are going to continue here with our explorations. I would imagine you guys can already see my screen. Yeah, everything should be on point, and we can begin. Right, so today we're going to talk about how to stay one step ahead. But before we do that, we need to do a little bit of a recap because we've covered a lot of things so far in the last few weeks. So I like to do a recap so that we have the right concepts in mind and so that nothing goes unnoticed. So let's do, oops. Okay. Let's do a quick recap of what we've seen so far in the mentorship, which will allow us to establish the context for today. And then we can enter the concepts of today's class. Right? So we began the mentorship talking about how to hide information. And in that context, hide information means how to play unexploitably, how to play a low exploitability strategy. That's how we started this mentorship. And we established a bunch of reasons why it is important to learn unexploitable strategies. We established a few contexts in which it should be a good idea to apply or to employ a low exploitability strategy, right? So a few of the examples that we saw was, for example, if you're playing those that are too frequent, then perhaps it can be a good idea to play a low exploitability strategy. And this has to do with what we talked about last week in the How to Remain Undetected class, which is that sometimes if you're playing a very highly exploitative strategy on early streets, that can show up very quickly in your stats. So perhaps if you're playing a very frequent node, it would be ideal to play a low exploitability strategy. So we talked about that. We talked also about how sometimes if you're playing someone who is better than you, it might be a good idea to also go for a low exploitability strategy instead of trying to exploit that guy, because perhaps you're going to lose the battle of who adjusts better if you consider that guy as more skilled than you in poker. So we had that context as well. And we also talked about how sometimes if you have exploited someone for some time and then they realize what you're doing to start to counter your strategy, then perhaps you could use the hit and run method to simply revert back to GTO so that you at least get to keep the money you made while you're exploiting that player. So those were a few of the contexts that we thought that, well, perhaps it makes sense to play low exploitability in these scenarios. But the most important thing, in my opinion, which I also have mentioned throughout that first week, is that the main goal of learning low exploitability strategies is to become an excellent exploitative player. In my opinion, that's the best product of being really good at balance strategies. Is that being very good at balance strategies is going to allow you to become a very great exploitative player. That's the most important thing, in my opinion. Once you become very good at balance play, once you become very good at understanding low exploitability strategies, the biggest benefit of this is that you will be better at detecting imbalances in your opponent's strategies. So you will know what it takes to be balanced. And therefore, if you know what it takes to be balanced, then you'll be able to spot when people don't have what it takes to be balanced. Right. So that's, in my opinion, the biggest thing about learning with solvers, learning patterns of GTO behavior, And this is something that for sure has made me much better in my career at exploiting other people when you understand what it takes to be balanced. Then we discussed a system for applying low exploitability strategies because it can be quite challenging to figure out how to actually approach the idea of playing low exploitability, the idea of playing close to solver. It can sometimes be very overwhelming. And in my life, I've always been a very advocate for systems and methodologies that allow you to have consistency in your execution. So we talked about the concept of an efficient execution, right? So how is it that we can arrive at a low expectability strategy with the lowest amount of possible effort? That would be an efficient execution. We're not spending tremendous amount of energy and time to figure out how to do that. If we can, in fact, achieve low exploitability with low effort, that would be the biggest thing. And in that context, we talked about a little bit the concept of the Pareto principle, which is the idea that perhaps in a lot of situations, 80% of your efforts will be responsible for 20% of your efforts will be responsible for 80% of your results. And I believe we can use this kind of principle in everything that we do, but especially in poker, where there are a lot of stuff that we can perhaps remove from our framework that are not going to be all that relevant for the profitability and the execution of our strategy. So that's what we covered in the first week. We covered that system, that framework that I recommend for you guys. And then we moved on our attention to, okay, this is what we should do when we want to play low exploitability. But what about how people are actually playing relative to solver? So that's what we talked about in the second week of training, where we exposed the gaps between human performance and solver performance. The second week, the theme was to how to gain information advantage, how to become aware of all these gaps between solver performance and human performance, which are very big. And we covered those, right? We covered all those situations where solver performance is at a given level, but when we take a look at the data, we see that human performance is not really close at all to that. And this is going to be one of the steps in our method for building exploitative strategies, which involves these 4 steps: gathering the data, then analyzing and comparing, and then calculating a counter strategy, and then of course, executing that counter strategy. This is the backbone of the methodology we have been using for this mentorship, and we've been covering each one of these steps in each of the weeks of training here. And when we expose the real gaps between humans and solver, we're talking mainly about the gathering data part, but also the analyze and compare part. And to analyze data, we talked about hand to node. You guys had a workshop with my partner Luis Girelli about hand to node, how to use this amazing software to expose the leaks of your opponents to study population data. This is really good. Hand to node may seem a little bit overwhelming at first, but it's very easy to use, and I hope that you guys are using it. I hope that the 6 months of free membership I got for you guys are going to be well utilized, because this program is for sure much better than the alternatives in the market. Not only the range research and all the things that we can do to study population tendencies, but also the HUD is much better. So I hope that you guys are making use of this software. And we moved on later to, in that same class, to expose exactly what those gaps were, right? Exactly what it is that people are deviating from solver. That's what we talked about in the second week of training. We arrived at these 4 frequency mistakes that people commonly have. So overfolding almost all the nodes of the game tree, under raising almost all the nodes of the game tree, lack of small bets, lack of over bets. Those were the frequency mistakes that we established by taking a look at the data. And of course, we can use that to exploit our opponents. So these were the frequency mistakes we found, but also we found range composition mistakes. And most of the range composition mistakes point to the fact that people overbluff the river, and we can use that information to arrive at more solid exploitative strategies that will extract EV from those leaks. So after we gathered all of this data, then we talked about the function of node locking in PO Solver that allows you to model your opponent's behavior so that you can then see what's the appropriate counter strategy. right? So I gave a workshop about this tool. You guys saw a video of the top 5 max exploit line you should have in your game, which I've built using exactly this tool. So this tool is really great to allow you to craft better exploitative strategies, because you can simply input any assumption in any different strategy that you think your opponents are going to be applying, and it calculates what should be the counter strategy. So with this, we can complete the cycle of the 4 steps here to building our exploitative strategies. We gather data, we analyze and compare, then we calculate the counter strategy. And the last step is, of course, to go into the real games and execute, which hopefully you guys have been doing so far in the last few weeks, applying already in your games all of the concepts that I've been discussing in this mentorship. And the idea is that by doing all of this, you're going to be maximizing your EV. Okay, that's the goal here. The goal is to make as much money as possible, right? That's what we want when we're playing poker. Well, at least almost always, the goal is to make as much money as you possibly can, and we can do that with exploitative strategies. GTO is great. GTO is awesome. In fact, a GTO bot would certainly beat any game, provided that there is a recreational player. But if you want to really maximize the EV, you really need an exploitative strategy. But then last week, we started a discussion that there is a little bit of a problem with exploitative strategies. There is a little bit of an issue with playing highly exploitative strategies. And what we discussed already is that, well, exploitative strategies are going to reveal some information, right? So in the act of trying to attack your opponent's imbalances, we become vulnerable ourselves in the process, right? So in the act of attacking an imbalance, we become also imbalanced. In the process of maximizing our EV by attacking a leak, we can say that we have introduced a leak in our own strategy, because the strategy that we need to play to attack an imbalance is an imbalanced strategy to begin with, right? So that's a problem. And it gets even worse when we do the research, because we're going to see that, well, we already saw, but whenever you study exploitative strategies, you will see this effect of the money you can make by exploiting is always lower than the amount you can lose by getting countered, which essentially means that to attack an imbalanced player, you have to become more imbalanced than that player you are attacking. Okay, so you expose yourself to more risk than the potential reward you're trying to get. So this is certainly something that we have to be concerned with. This is not necessarily an advice against exploitative strategies. That is not what this is. It's just that we need to be aware of this. We need to understand exactly where we're putting our shoes on, exactly what is that we're headed into when we play exploitative strategies. So my concern every time I studied exploitative strategies in the past was, well, how can we make effective exploits? And I define an effective exploit as an exploit where I get to make the money, but I also get to keep it. Because if you play an exploitative strategy, but then you're always making yourself vulnerable to the point that your opponents are countering you, then it just basically the game becomes an exchange of money where you exploit the guy here, then he counters you there, and then you just keep exchanging money with that player. And either no one is really benefiting from it, or maybe the other guy is benefiting from it because you're not necessarily good with that process. So an effective exploit would be an exploit that makes extra money and that also gets to keep it, right? That would be really important for us. And that's when the concept of remaining undetected arrives, right? So it would be really nice if we could exploit someone and then they would never notice. Because if they never notice, then that's awesome. We get to keep that money because we're not going to face any resistance from those players. And that's exactly what we talked about last week, how to remain undetected. And the idea of remaining undetected is that perhaps, well, of course, you will make less money per exploit because now you have to make a lower intensity exploit against that player. So the EV gain per exploit is lower, but perhaps you can maximize the time that you're spending exploiting because you're revealing less information and then you get to remain undetected. So perhaps this is even better than going with a full intensity exploit and then making it obvious to your opponent what you're doing and then losing that exploit in the future. So we talked about strategies for remaining undetected, what it is that we need to do to remain undetected and to avoid letting our opponents know exactly how we are exploiting them. And this is where we discussed minimally exploitative strategies. So instead of maximally exploitative strategies, which were discussed in the third week, last week we discussed minimally exploitative strategies. So strategies that do not go with the full intensity in the exploiting part, and they are a little bit more conservative with how it is that they search for that extra EV. And we discussed a few strategies for playing minimally exploitative strategies. We discussed, for example, that if you want to play a minimally exploitative strategy, you can keep the early streets intact. So you can keep the early street pseudo GTO with a low exploitability execution. And in that way, you reveal less information about your opponents and what you're doing. Your flop stats, your pre-flop stats are going to be very close to solver. And in that way, there's not much really that your opponent can infer from those numbers. It's just another guy in the pool, right? Nothing that stands out. And but this one was very conservative because it's the one that reduces our reward the most, right? So essentially, by having the pre-flop and the flop fixed, we're drastically reducing the potential reward we have from exploitative strategies, but we can still have some reward, of course. And then we discussed additional alternatives, the partial frequency adjustment, where instead of going all the way with the max exploit, you just adjust your frequencies partially, which is a middle ground between adjusting fully and not adjusting at all. You just adjust a little bit. And we discussed the approach of mixing the balanced approach with the max exploit approach with the use of a randomizer. That's very easy to do, and I recommend that you do that in a lot of different scenarios. And within that context, we discussed that, well, there are only two ways our opponents can gain information about our strategy, right? The only two ways are through our HUD stats, where people can see our frequencies. And the second way is through our showdowns, where people can see our range composition. So the objective of the objective of minimally exploitative strategies is to give less evidence, right? So we're trying to remain undetected, and we just established that the way we could potentially get detected is by running crazy stats or by going with crazy hands to showdown, because those are the only two things that people can have information on us. So if you want to give less evidence, then, well, you're going to have to exploit in ways that control your frequencies, and you're going to have to exploit in ways that avoid revealing too much on showdowns. So that's what we discussed so far in this context of exploitative strategies. And in that context, we have to remind ourselves that we're talking about playing against competent and observant players, right? So typically, if someone is not very competent, we're not going to be too concerned with the fact that they could counter-exploit us. And if people are not observant, or they are incapable of observing, for example, if the game is anonymous, if the game doesn't have a HUD, then all of this becomes of much less importance because the risk of getting countered is much lower. Okay, but in a context where our opponents are competent, they are observant, then when they notice what we're doing, and this, I talked about this in the PokerMate Simple Week. I don't recall talking it here in the mentorship, but once someone notices what we're doing, then there are only three things that can happen. Either they're not going to adjust, or they're going to adjust partially, or they're going to adjust fully. Okay, those are the only three things that can happen when someone realizes that you're trying to exploit them. The first thing, I talked a lot about the situation where people don't adjust at all in the PokerMate Simple Week. Sometimes this can be hard for some people to realize, but I also showed you guys a graph of the high stakes player of last year, made 10 big blinds per 100 at high stakes, playing known pools. Sometimes people don't adjust. Sometimes people don't want to get into the trouble or the conflict of fighting back against you and playing more high variance strategies and calling down lighter and etc. So sometimes people don't adjust at all. I've seen this many times in my career where I kept exploiting the same players, and they just would keep their usual strategy with no adjustments. So sometimes the guy is going to notice what you're doing, but he's not going to adjust. And other times, there's a certain probability that people will adjust partially. We're going to talk about exactly what that means. And there's also probability that that person will adjust fully, okay? Now, when someone adjusts partially, we're going to see some numbers in a minute. You're going to lose a little bit of money, okay? We're going to see some examples, some numerical examples. But sometimes people are going to adjust, but they're going to adjust partially to what you're doing. Yeah, maximally exploitative adjustments or counters to your own exploit are not necessarily obvious, right? It requires sometimes changing prior street strategy. It requires changing the strategy with different hand classes than you're used to. So not necessarily should say that because someone noticed what you're doing that they're going to adjust fully. In fact, I'm going to talk about here how that's actually very rare that someone correctly adjusts fully against your exploit. Almost 100% of the time, people are going to be adjusting partially to what you're doing. And then if people adjust fully, then of course you're going to lose a bunch of money. We're going to see some examples here where it gets really crazy when someone adjusts correctly in the exact maximum way, but we're going to see those examples in a minute. Now, when Villain noticed what you're doing, and this is the topic of the last 2 weeks, right? Before that, we were not too concerned with it, but in the context of remaining undetected, or in the context of today of staying one step ahead, the assumption is that your opponent realized what you're doing, or at least he has a sense of the exploit you implemented against them, and now they're starting to adjust. When someone starts to change their behavior against you, they start to play differently than they would usually play against you in specific because he saw something that you did, then you have two options here. You have the defensive approach, the offensive approach. The defensive approach, we already talked about. You go back to TTO. In the offensive approach, you double down on the exploit, which is the topic of today's class. Just going quickly here of this reverting back to GTO, which is defensive style, this is something that is safe to execute in a sense that you're guaranteed not to lose if you are in fact playing very close to balanced, right? Apart from Rake, of course, everyone knows about Rake, right? It also doesn't require caring about metagaming history. This is something that some people struggle with. They're like, man, I'm not sure if I can play exploitative strategy because it requires keeping track of how this guy is perceiving me, what was the recent past history between us, etc. And by just reverting back to GTO, you don't have to care about that. You saw the guy showing some resistance, you just start playing balanced against them, and you don't worry about it anymore. It also doesn't require knowing what is the actual counter to the counter. So if I were to try and exploit what he's doing to me, I would have to know how it is that I should be doing that. But if you can revert back to TO, then you don't need to know that. And the idea here is very simple. You just made some money against that guy, but then he noticed, and now you just keep the money you made. You don't allow that guy to keep countering you because then he would just lose back all the money you made against him. So you made some money because regardless of how quick and how good people are at adjusting, it's impossible to adjust instantly, right? People are going to need some evidence of what you're doing before they can adjust against you. So you made some money with your exploits, then people realize what you're doing, and then you just stop it and you keep that money, right? The only problem is that playing balance is a little bit hard, right? So balancing all those ranges correctly and putting the appropriate amount of different hand classes in the correct proportions in each of your ranges is not something that's necessarily easy to do. Picking the appropriate bet size in every single spot is not something that is the easiest thing to do. So the only downside of this method here of reverting back to TO is that it's hard to do. And I should also include that, well, you're just going to make a limited amount of money with exploits if every time someone notices, you just stop, right? Because eventually, if the guy is competent and observant, which were the first two assumptions we're talking about, the players were going to be concerned with this. Eventually, they're going to, have an idea that you're adjusting. So You just limit yourself a lot when you just stop it every time someone shows resistance. Okay. But that's one way of doing it. And to do it, you use the system that we described in the first week. You can also build your own system for applying low exploitability strategies. I try to give my own idea of what that system should look like for maximum efficiency. I'm always concerned with maximum efficiency. Now, the context, what we're talking about today is if you make the second decision. And this is where sometimes I don't get, it seems like people don't perceive this as an option. But if someone shows resistance against you, it's not game over. It's not like, oh, the guy noticed what I'm doing, game over. No, not necessarily, okay? You can keep adjusting against each other. And the way that you would do it correctly is you would double down on the exploit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. Now, doubling down on the exploit is basically about shifting what exactly it is that you need to do now to exploit that player. So you were playing a certain strategy A, your opponent shifted to a certain strategy B that now he thinks he's exploiting you. And now you need to shift from A to C to exploit what it is that strategy B that guy is playing against you. Okay, so it's a constant game of adjustment. So to double down against your opponents, first of all, you need to keep track of the metagaming history between you two. That's something that is mandatory. You cannot be successful in the exploitative game if you don't keep track of what it is that is going on against particular players, especially if you're playing small pools. You need to keep track of what's going on between you and that particular player. It is also required that you know exactly what to do when people start countering. Okay, you can't come into the arena without being prepared for the possible outcomes. You always have to prepare yourself beforehand. And usually the person who is more prepared is the one who's going to win. So you need to be prepared to what it is that I need to do now that my opponent showed resistance. You need to know that. And then here comes the best part, which is that if you can do this correctly, then you win absurd amounts of money. Because it's when people go into the offense to try and counter you, to try and adjust against you, that they make themselves the most vulnerable. Okay? So recall that we talked about, when you play exploitative strategies, you make yourself vulnerable. And that's true. That is in fact true. But notice how that is also true for your opponent. Okay? That is also true for your opponent. Now that he is trying to go out there and show resistance against your strategy and play differently against you, he's also making himself more vulnerable than he was before he adjusted anything. Okay? So you were exploiting, let's say you're exploiting some river overfold by some guy. So then you were overbluff against them. Now the guy starts overcalling you. This act of overcalling against you is making this guy more exploitable than he was beforehand. So your opponent is making himself much more vulnerable than he was before. And this is sometimes something that some film poker players don't get it. They think, it's game over. No, it's not game over. What is going to happen now is if you guys want to keep pursuing this exploitative exchange, then it becomes a game of who adjusts better or who adjusts faster and better. Okay, so there are two components here to the adjustment game. Is the speed with which you can do it. So how quickly you can perceive the evidence and adjust, and how accurate is your adjustment, right? Because there can be plenty of different options of adjustments, and the one who plays the better adjustment, the one who maximizes the EV, it's going to come out victorious in the end. So there are two scenarios here. If both of you try to pursue this adjustment game, and this can happen, particularly if you're playing in mid to high stakes games in small pools. If you're playing exploitative strategies, this will eventually happen. You're going to have this very specific dynamic against the specific player. Okay, so there are only two things that can happen here if both of you get into this war between you two. Either you're going to be equally capable of exploiting and adjusting against each other. So you make some money against him, then he makes some money off of you, then you do the same against him. Basically, nobody wins because you're both equally capable of doing the adjustment game. You have similar skill, you're adjusting at similar speeds, and the accuracy of both of your adjustments is very similar. So basically just keep exchanging money against each other, but no one really makes any money. You're just sometimes you win, sometimes he wins, and that's it. But there is a scenario in which you are better than this guy at the adjustment game, or he's better than you, and then somebody wins, right? And then maybe you're quicker than the other guy at adjusting. You perceive the evidence much sooner than him, or the accuracy of your exploitments is much higher than the accuracy of their exploits. So those are the only two scenarios that can happen. Either nobody's going to win this war, or somebody's going to win this adjustment game. Okay, and hopefully it's going to be you. So there's usually this fear of getting countered, right? And this is what we have to address by studying off the tables. You don't have to fear your opponents countering you, because once your opponents counter you in a kind of a sadistic way, you should actually feel happy about it, because now it's like you were luring someone to the battlefield, and now finally they took the bait and they joined you in the battlefield. And now is where they're making themselves the most vulnerable than they were before. So we need to address this fear of getting countered, because this is mostly a psychological thing that can get into the way of you making a lot of money. If you keep this fear of getting countered, you're going to limit your capacity as a poker player, because it's when people are trying to fight back that they make themselves the most vulnerable, and that you can attack them and make the most money. Okay, so we need to address, for example, perhaps the insecurity of being in an unknown situation. And this is very classical. We fear the unknown. This is very psychological of human beings. It probably has plenty of evolutionary roots here. We're not going to get into that, but the fact is that the unknown, especially when it's like the complete unknown, sometimes just a little bit unknown can be exciting, but just the complete unknown can make us feel very insecure. So we need to study like we're doing here to see that, oh, it's actually not a monster of seven heads like we talk about in Portuguese. Not sure if there's a phrase for it in English, but it's not this super crazy thing that is a lot of risk. No, that is something that I can deal with that. I can build a plan for that. So we deal with that feeling of insecurity, and we perhaps sometimes we can deal with the feeling of lacking confidence that you can actually win that battle against that guy. This should also be addressed, and we address lack of confidence with more study, right? With more preparation. You need to go into the grind prepared for what are the scenarios that can come. And usually the people that are more prepared are going to make the most money. So we need to address those two things by studying and by getting better. And the first thing to address these feelings of either feeling insecure or lacking confidence to win this exploitative battle is, well, the first thing you need to know is, what is the counter to your own strategy? That's the first thing you need to know if you're concerned with exploitative battles and adjustments, this adjustment war against other players. Because it's by knowing what is the counter to your own strategy that you're going to be able to realize whether people are properly adjusting against you or not. Okay, so the first thing when we study exploitative strategies, we shouldn't only study what is it that we need to do against other people. We should study what it is that other people should do against us when we play that way. That's extremely important, extremely important. And that's what we're going to cover right now. Let's take one example from the lines that we saw in the last 2 weeks, which is a classical line that in one of the complementary videos, I most certainly recommended you guys to play with the max exploit approach. Here we have the big blind versus button facing bet check bet line. We see some insane deviations here, right? Like 17% overfold to a small reopen, 13% overfold to half pot, 8% overfold, 3/4 sizing, 10% overfold to small overbet. Some really nasty deviations, and recreational players deviating more than regs, which is actually quite rare. It's actually very rare that recreationals would fold more than regs, but this is one of the spots where they do it. We see there's 16% overfold to the half pot sizing. Really insane stuff, right? So this is a node where the reward for playing exploitative is just so high that it would be certainly a mistake to not try and take that money. It's just too much money we're talking about here. This is like 3-4 big blinds worth per hand of EV per one bluff. It's really insane how much money we can make in a situation that is actually also very frequent in the game tree. It happens quite often, right? So we saw an example where we would have, for example, this GTO strategy for this particular board, and I limited to only 2 bet sizes for the model to be simpler. So we had that King 7 deuce texture, 9-3 ran out, so a very blank you ran out. So we have it's easier to work with. And then once we modeled the out of positions response, then we saw that the position strategy shifted to something really aggressive, where even a hand like ace queen is supposed to be bluffed here. A hand that has like 33, almost 34% accurate in the check back line is getting bluffed because it makes more money doing so. Now, what is it that we need to know? We need to know what is, or what should be, your opponent max counter to your strategy. And that's where things are going to start to get interesting. So I want to hear from you guys in the chat. How is it that the out-of-position player should play to maximally counter your strategy or our strategy that we developed here as the button? Recall how that strategy looks like, right? We see here a complete separation between bet sizes. Well, actually almost complete, because there's some 9x value betting with the half pot size. So we see 10-9 value betting for half, Jack 9, Queen 9, but then everything else is a bluff. And then with the bigger size, we're just basically value betting Ace 9 plus value betting for the bigger size. Okay. What is OP max counter against that strategy? Who can enlighten me about that? Check range, high check raise. Interesting. How check raise, but how high? Let's get quantitative here. How high? Just an estimation. Obviously, we're not going to be able to nail the exact number, but how high? Okay, 20%. Checks from hands on the river more. Okay. Is our strategy on the river locked? Yeah, the strategy for the IP, let's assume that we lock the IP player strategy and then we unlock the OP player. Okay. Just like we did for the OP, now we do for ourselves. We lock this exploitative strategy for ourselves, and then we unlock the OP player. Don't bet any pairs on the river, check call instead. Cool. What about the other hands though? What about air hands? What about Mr. Draws, etc.? The max exploit strategy would come from adjusting the flop. I would never raise with any value. Nice. I like that. Check call with bluff catchers and strong hands and probe with air. Cool. Check raise blockers. What about the distinction between the two sizes, right? Recall here that we have two sizes. So we have one half pot size and 1 3/4 size. What's the difference between facing those two sizes for the OP player? Or is value heavy? Yes. So what's the weakest hand that OP should call versus the 3/4? It's always important that we try to estimate some thresholds, right? Probe, check raise, thresh. Not sure how to decide which is better. So PNA is already considering something here. Perhaps our trash hands, not clear whether they should probe or check raise instead. King X, top pair. Yeah, nice, nice. Very good. So let's take a look. Let's take a look. This model is only for the river, so we can't see, for example, what our friend Alvaro talked about, the adjustment on the prior streets. I just decided to keep this model very simple so that we see the river only. But of course, the max exploit counter would involve perhaps even changing the prior street strategy. So the first thing we observe here, and this is with the reaction versus bets locked as GTO. Okay, so I didn't put any assumptions on how the IP player deviates from solver by facing bets. Only when the other position player checks is that we have the IP player making those deviations. All of the other nodes for the IP player remained GTO. Okay. In that context, we see what our friend Artem said, which is OP checks range. Now, every single hand in the other position player's range maximized with the check. Not only the bluff catchers, but also the air hands. We see hands like 5-4 suited maximizing with the pure check, and all of the missed broadways like Queen Jack, Queen 10, Jack 10, even though unpaired, they also maximize with the check. Against the 3/4 size, we see something that you guys already anticipated. It's super value heavy range, so the only hands that can call profitably are top pairs. Everything else should just fold. But then we see here that a lot of check jams, even with bluffs, hands that were already present in the GTO solution, can stay here as bluffs. So hands like 5-3 suited, check raise bluffing, 4-3 suited, check raise bluffing, and even some non-GTO bluffs like pocket 8s, pocket 6s, also check raise bluffing here. And then against the half pot sizing, we see a very crazy counter adjustment where OP, of course, never folds, and then check jams 46% of the time with an additional 17% check raise with the half pot size. So a very, very, very aggressive check raise strategy here. Considering that, well, first of all, that range, the bulk of that value bet range is Queen 9, Jack 9, 10, 9. Actually, the only hands that value bet, no, there's some 9, 6 as well. But basically, it's 9x medium kicker is the value betting range. So a hand like Ace 9, for example, becomes the nuts. So Ace 9 is the nuts here, and the other position player should just check jam for 5x pot with second pair here because it is the nuts, the effective nuts against that range construction. And then we see a bunch of bluffs. In fact, pretty much all of the unpaired hands are just going for the all-in. So 6-4 suited, 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited, 8-6 suited, 8-5 suited, Ace-5 off, Ace-4 off, all Ace-8, all going for the check jam because that range is just garbage. And then we see some really sick plays, but again, it's sick because it's super out of line relative to what we usually do. But a hand like pocket 6s, for example, is going for a small check raise for value here because 6s against the half pot size has almost 85% equity. So the other position player can force the IP player to back call with a lot of ace highs, and he goes ahead and he check raises for value with pocket 6s, check raises 7-6, even pocket 5s getting in there. Okay, so it becomes obviously a crazy, crazy simulation. The craziest thing about it is what we discussed a little bit in the last week, which is when we see what is the EV effect of each of these strategies. When we take a look at our initial exploit, we can go from 392 392.5 big blinds per 100 on this node of EV to 413.4, which is a 5.3% boost in the EV of our strategy for exploiting our opponent. If he, however, applies this maximally counter strategy against our overbluffing strategy, then relative to GTO, we lose 66% of our EV. We go from 392.5 to 133.4, right? So that's the thing we talked about in the beginning, where you always make yourself much more exploitable than your opponent was making him exploitable in the first place. Now, the good news for us is that no one reacts like that, okay? No one even knows this. No one has the balls to do this. Even if they knew, they wouldn't have the balls to do this. So this is where we start to understand that in real life, this is not how people are going to adjust against your exploitative strategies. You're not going to see someone check shoving second pair for 5x spot for value just because they saw that you're massively over bluffing and picking a different size with your value bets. This is not what you're going to see. In practice, in 7 years of playing exploitative strategies, I've never seen someone play the actual full adjustment, the full counter maximum exploitative strategy against or exploits. In real life, what is it that you can expect? You can expect certainly overcalls. You can definitely expect that in practice, people are going to start calling more with the hands that they were supposed to fold. So here I have a model where instead of folding 45% as the GTO solution would suggest, I modeled what I would expect a player that perceived you as very aggressive to start doing with their strategy. This is just basically just going to start calling more. So I introduced here 15% more calls, basically in the pair region. So basically OP is never folding a pair anymore, but you still see someone folding some ace highs, and perhaps some very weak pairs like 5 deuce, 4 deuce, they might still fold. But for sure, you can expect people to start overcalling and to perhaps loosening their thresholds for going to showdown against you. That's for sure something you can expect. As far as raises, I would definitely not expect something crazy. I kept here the GTO level of check raises, but sometimes I wouldn't even expect the GTO level of check raises, to be honest, because people are bad at check raising. But this is something that you could expect as reasonable. People are going to check raise a bit more relative to what they were doing before, and they were overcalled. And in that context, when you simulate that adjustment, not the max adjustment that makes you lose 66%, now against this counter adjustment, we lose 9.6 relative to GTO. And of course, we're still losing. It's not like we can be immune. So if we do get countered here, we were going to lose some money, but it's not like it's going to be a disaster that we're just losing all our profits. We're losing here a little bit of the EV, and certainly more than what we gained before. Right? So this is the first thing that we have to establish when we're considering first how to main undetect it and then how to double down on exploits, is that it is worth to take that risk to get into the adjustment game, because people are much less prepared than us to fully understand how far they should go with their adjustment. And it's fucking uncomfortable to go all the way with the adjustments. So if people are not going to adjust to the level and to the capacity that we are going to adjust, then it's very likely that we're going to win this battle, because we're preparing ourselves for what is going to come, and we know exactly how far we need to go with our exploits. Let's take a look at another example here. This one will be quicker, but just so you guys can have more of this intuition and take a look at the numbers. Recall the triple barrel node that we modeled the last class, actually the third week's class, the max exploit class. We saw that people are overfolding to triple barrel. Okay, so this is the GTO range construction of a triple barrel node, King 7 deuce 9 3. So we bet small on the flop. I believe the simulation had 3/4 on the turn, and then we get called. And this is the river strategy. We have 3 different sizes here just for simplification. a pot size, 3/4 size, half pot size. We see value bets mixing between multiple sizes, this and that, etc. We saw that people make a lot of mistakes in a triple barrel, particularly regs overfold a lot. Well, actually not a lot, overfold medium amount, let's say. And then they also underraise. The underraise is not on screen, but they also underraise on this node. So we see, for example, 11% overfold versus half pot, 5% overfold against 3/4 size, 6% overfold against small overbet. We saw all those deviations already. And when we model for these deviations, we see a few interesting things. We see that our bluffs all go for the half pot size. It's the size that maximizes EV with our bluffing hands because it gets the most disproportionate overfold. So we see all bluffs going for the half pot size. We see value bets that were mixing between multiple sizes, like kings, for example, mixing pot, 3/4, and half. And then also ace king that we're mixing all, and pocket nines that we're mixing all. They now all maximize with the bigger size, which is a little bit counterintuitive to some people. They think, oh, people overfold, so I'm going to have to size down. That's actually not true. You should think about what is the sizing that gets disproportionate overfold. Typically, you don't want to put your value bets in the sizing that gets the bigger overfold. So here, the half pot size gets the bigger overfold, and then the value hands don't maximize with that size. You should be sizing up. And then we have a few hands maximizing with the 3/4 size, specifically king 10 and king 8. All right, so that's what we saw in the third week. And then here, the counter adjustments are very similar to what you guys saw in that last example. Against the value heavy sizing, which is the pot sizing, we see basically no calls here. Only 2 pairs calling this time. Not even top pair can call against this range construction. And then there is a few bluff check raises like 9-6, 9-8 type hands. Against 3/4, we see similar stuff. 3/4 is basically king 10 and king 10 and king 8 value betting and almost nothing else. Some king 6 actually as well, but basically just those value hands. And now here we see something extreme, which is that king jack can go all in against that size because basically it's the nuts against that range, but then there's no calling range. And then against the half pot, we see, of course, no folds. And we see a lot of check raises, both for value, but also with bluffs. We see Mr. Broadway's bluffing, and we see all those value bets with king X plus. In this scenario, if we can successfully exploit the overfold from our opponent, then we gain 11.27% EV in this node. And then if we cast max countered, we lose 69.7 of the GTO EV. If people play this way against us, like they never fold against half and then raise thin for value, and with all of those bluffy hands, King Jack, Queen 10, Jack 10, and then if they overfold to the value heavy size, then we lose 69.7% of our EV. But of course, we already established that no one's going to do that. No one's going to have sufficient clairvoyance to know that your ranges are set up in that way to make this exact adjustment. And people are also not going to have necessarily the technical capacity to arrive at what should be the actual adjustment. In real life, what can you expect in real life? You can expect, again, people to make a little bit more calls, maybe go back at the solver threshold for raises, the appropriate amount of check raises in solver land. This is typically what you can expect, right? So here I made what I would say is a real life model of a potential adjustment of our opponents, where I took the GTO fold frequency and dropped it by 10 to 15% because that's what I would typically expect. So here, adaptation players never folding second pair, never folding top pair, and also mostly calling with the third pair hands. So most of the third pair hands calling here, and then some bluff check raises, some value check raises. In that circumstance, instead of losing 69.7, we lose 7.6%. Okay, we are losing. As I said, we cannot be immune to that, but it's not the end of the world. that we should feel like it's not worth the risk. It's certainly worth the risk for this price here, considering that most people are not even going to realize they're getting exploited. So in the context, are these EVs from the initial row of the tree or just from the river node? All these trees, they're only river, right? So they don't have prior streets. They start on the river. So that's the river EV. So again, what we should consider is this. Villain noticed. What can happen once he noticed? Well, there's a probability that he's not going to adjust. This probability is higher than 0 for sure. There's a probability that he would adjust partially, and there's a probability that he would adjust fully. All of those probabilities should sum up to 1 because those are the only events possible. In the event that he doesn't adjust, you make a lot of money, that's for sure. And here, always recall that fighting back is uncomfortable. It means that this guy has to go to conflict with you. So not all people are going to necessarily want to do that. But so this is going to happen. Some people are not going to adjust against you. Of course, not all, but some. And then they can partially adjust or fully adjust. But fully adjust, I would say, almost impossible. I haven't seen anyone capable of gathering enough evidence, both on my strategy and my student strategy, to the point that they would, in fact, first know that they should play the max exploit counter, and then know what the max exploit counter is, and then apply that max exploit counter. Okay, I believe that it is extremely unlikely that you would ever play against someone who's capable of playing a full adjustment. Pretty much every time you're going to be playing against someone who's going to be executing a partial adjustment. And of course, if you don't do anything about it, you're going to lose some money. It's just that we don't need to fear it because the adjustment that people are capable of making is a partial adjustment that the risk is not all that high for us in the end of the day. Now, let's take a look at the delay CVAT example that we talked about to further improve our idea of the counter and counter to the counter. That's typically what we should be studying when we're playing exploitative strategies. Can we expect partial max counter exploit counters from the more observant opponents, like doing those max exploits, but only sometimes? No, I would not expect ever max exploit counters. Recall that we're talking about these strategies, right? Max exploit counters are these strategies where people have extreme clairvoyance of what you're doing, and they react exactly in the max EV way against all of your ranges, which is sometimes includes check shoving 5x spot with second pair. No, I don't think that's ever going to happen. Okay, not even for the strongest players, because no one is studying these things. That's the thing. Like, no one is studying these things, and no one actually would have the balls to do it, even if they were studying. It's just something very difficult. So the delay CVAT node is another one that we discussed in the last few weeks. And we saw that population is incredibly exploitable here. We saw that these were their frequencies. I should have put the GTO frequencies here for comparison. Well, that's unfortunate. But we saw that regulars, we took exactly that type of board texture, which is low board with a high card turn. And in low boards with high card turn, regulars are folding 42% to small bet, raising 11%, and then to 2/3 size, they're folding 55 and raising 5, and against the overbet, folding 71 and raising 2.5. And when we model this deviation in the node locking program, we see a very sick max exploit strategy, which gets us checking top pair plus and betting everything else for the small size. That's the max exploit strategy we saw for the delayed CVAT node in the last 2 weeks. Now, question again for you guys. What is, or what should be, the max exploit counter for the IP player against this delay CVAT strategy? How should the IP player react to maximize EV? I want to hear your guys' thoughts. Come on, ideas. Overcall turn and over raise turn over fold river. Okay, try to be a little bit more specific because over raising turn. What does that mean? How much should he raise? How light can he call? Strong check black some flops with strong pairs for sure. That would involve it. Never fold to bet. Never bluff when check too. Nice. Check range, facing a check. Check back all top pair on the flop to call flop, stab trash on the flop. Interesting. In this model here, we're going to see turn and forward. Okay, so again, because of the size of the tree, we're going to take a look at the turn forward, so we're not going to be able to see the flop adjustments. But for sure, I would expect more flop check backs with the top of the range for sure, and perhaps the more betting with trash on the flop is not necessarily the case because we can make some money bluff raising this super weak betting range, right? So the flop betting more with air, I'm not sure, but the check back with strong hands, I would say, yeah, for sure. Probably fold 10%, raise 25, 30%. Okay, cool. 75 check raise. What do you mean check raise? Because we're discussing the IP player here. Check back range and check raise turn. Why are you guys talking about check raise? We're discussing the IP player. Am I misunderstanding what you guys are saying? Check back range. I guess you just mean raise, right? Instead of check raise. Check back range and raise turn with all value draws and blockers. Raise all trash versus turn delay. I like float and bet reverse versus check. Nice. The actual max display counter, raise sets plus, other hands call. The actual max display counter here is to raise any two cards versus that range. Well, I guess there's 4.5% folds in there with the absolute trash, 4, 3, 4 deuce, 5 deuce. But pretty much 90% raises and 2% calls. That's a max exploit counter versus bet size. And versus the check, most of you guys were right. Just checking back, pretty much range. A little bit of value bets going on, like pocket eights, 8-7, etc. But pretty much raise entire range versus bet, check entire range versus check. And I don't have to be the one to tell you guys this. Nobody will react like that. Okay. That's what have always made me very comfortable with exploitative strategies. Because I've studied things and I've seen that in order for me to get fucked up doing the things that I want to do, people have to make adjustments that no one is going to know that this is how far they should take it. And even if they would know, it's really hard to convince yourself to raise any two cards versus someone, right? So all of you here, you all are very strong players because you're here, you're studying. And most of your initial intuitions about how far you should take it is much more conservative, right? You guys would still fold a lot of hands. You guys would still not raise many hands. And that's typically what's going to be in people's heads. And this is considering that you guys have clairvoyance over what we're discussing here, you know that this is the actual strategy. In games, people, of course, don't have clairvoyance over your own strategies. Why do we still want to raise with value if they are this weak and most likely continue stabbing river so we can bluff catch? Well, this model doesn't include any over bluffs on the river, right? Recall that this model here, we didn't node lock river tendencies. So there's no over bluffing going on the river here. So all this model has is the opposition player playing this strategy on the turn. Betting with this range, checking with this other range. There's no assumption that river is going to be over bluffed. And well, we raise because what's going to happen here is that basically pocket sixes for the AP player here is almost the nuts, right? So the value of the hands for the AP player just increases too much, and then the OP player is gonna have to bluff catch with those hands on the river, right? So nobody will react in these max exploit ways. Nobody has clairvoyance over your strategy to know that this is what you're doing. And even if they did, they wouldn't know that this is how they should react. And even if they knew that this is how they should react, they wouldn't have the balls to do it. So what we need to do is always have a sense for, okay, what is a more typical adjustment I can expect from my opponents? Because the actual max counter, nah, that's not going to happen. But we can have a sense of what would be a real life adjustment that we can expect from people. And in real life, I would expect something more like this. Certainly more raises. I would expect that for sure, particularly with the draw region. So you see here that I assumed a lot of raises with the straight draw region. Some raises with air, of course, as well. Some king highs raises sometimes, some ace highs. Much less folding. So in the data, people are folding 42%. I put here 20% less folds, even a little bit below the solver level. So basically, this is what you would typically expect. Of course, not exactly this range. We can't know exactly how it is that people are going to react, but certainly not so much different than this. Definitely a bit more raises, and we can expect certainly less folds as well than usual, right? When we exploit this node here, we see that we have pretty substantial EV boost. We go from 353.6 in GTO to 422.8 in a max exploit strategy, having a boost of almost 20% in our EV. If we get max counter, which is the any two card raise, and then pure check back facing a check, we lose 47.5. And if we have this adjustment here with a lot more raise than GTO, in fact, I think GTO was raising like 14% here, and then much less folding, then we lose 36% relative to GTO, right? So this is something that we could expect as something that would cost us money. Now, how is it that we get better at the adjustment game? Now that we are prepared, or that we have at least some idea of how it is that our opponents can react against our strategy, how it is that we should react knowing that this is what they're doing now, which is now my following question to you guys. What should be the out of position counter to this IP counter? What should be the max exploit strategy against someone who is playing this strategy against your delayed c-bet? What you should do here as the OP player? What it is that we should do. Any ideas? Now we start betting value and less trash. Bet on turn with value more. Value heavy delay. Stop betting air and bet with value. Check all mid hands and trash. drop air. Nice. Very nice. It's most of it is intuitive, right? Most of it is intuitive. Fight fire with fire, raise everything. Most of it is intuitive. Perhaps a few things are not so much, but most of it is relatively intuitive. Basically, what we're gonna do here is, Jesus. What we're gonna do here is exactly what you guys are talking about. We see now that the value shifted to betting. So we see Queen X plus and even hands like pocket nines and tens now really more interested in betting. We see the weakest bluff catchers, deuces through fives and ace highs, pretty much the medium kicker ace high shifted to checking. And then the air, it depends on the exact blockers. We see some air still want to bet. There's going to be some air that's going to go for the bet 3-bet because it's going to have unblockers to the folding range of the LP player against the bet 3-bet. Some air checking, hands like Jack 9, probably due to blocking too much of the bluffing range. And then some hands going for mixed strategies. So hands like King 9 still now mixing King 4. So even though the villain is over raising, some air is going to mix here because recall that villain is checking back pure against our checks, which means that on the river, he's going to have a super strong range. And I didn't include here, but when you have the IP player checking back entire range versus your checks, what's going to happen is you can't lead anything on the river. Otherwise, you're going to be imbalanced because IP is just much stronger than you. So you basically are forced to check range on the river. So the air hands, they lose money in both situations. So some of them, depending on the blocker, can still be played as mixed strategies. Not that batting is good, it's just that both batting and checking are bad. Right, so we have this, but typically what you're going to see is now the value is interested again in batting, and the bluff catchers, particularly the weakest bluff catchers, are now not so interested in batting anymore. And I was trying to recall here what is the next slide about. And the next slide I included also quickly, what is the counter to the counter in that previous node that we discussed. Let's go back to that previous node where we were bet check betting, right? So in this previous node, actually was one before that even. In this previous node where we were bet check betting, and then our opponent was overcalling like this, what should be the counter to the counter? How should we react to someone overcalling? That's one is even more obvious. We're just going to thin value bet and stop bluffing, right? So I included that print here as well, where the counter to the counter of someone woke up to the fact that you are over bluffing the bet check bet line and they start over calling a little bit. Well, we just see this shift here where now we just always check our air and then we value bet everything for the biggest sizing, and we can value bet as thin as 7-5. So when someone is overcalling a little bit here, we just become more value heavy and we loosen our thresholds for value bets. And even a hand like 7-5 now is supposed to reopen for a 3/4 size, which is just third pair weak kicker, but we have to value bet against someone overcalling, right? So the adjustments, of course, it's hard to know how far you should take it, and that's why we need to study off the tables to know exactly how far we should take it. But the principles are not necessarily difficult to grasp. If you're playing a circumstance where you're applying a population exploit, typically what do you want to do? You want to overbluff, you want to slow play value, and you want to bet weak bluff catchers. You want to overbluff because people overfold almost all nodes the game tree. You want to slow play value because of the fact that people overfold, the view of putting money in yourself decreases. And because they overbluff, the view of checking increases. So typically slow playing value is a very good exploitative strategy against population. And then we bet weak bluff catchers because the overfolding on the raise is very beneficial for those hands. Those hands would really like to get folds from worse hands because even worse hands would be able to bluff them off on future streets. So any model you make where you include an overfold and another raise, weak bluff catchers will start to bet into the pot. Unless it's a specific line where the overbluff is so huge that perhaps it surpasses the EV you gain from getting those hands to fold. If it's a unique situation like that, where the EV of the overbluff surpasses the EV of getting those hands to fold, then perhaps you would want to slow play those as well. But typically, especially on flops and turns, you would want to bet your bluff catchers. But then when people wake up to that and start to apply the counter, then you're going to want to shift. You're going to want to invert that strategy. You're going to want to apply a thin value bet strategy. Now that your bluffs are not going to make money, either not going to make much money or no money at all at this point. But then your value bets are going to make much more money because the expanded calling range of your opponent increases your equity when called, which of course increases the EV of value betting. So many hands that you would otherwise check, you're going to now start thin value bet. Now, typically you want to fast play value as well, because the EV of putting money into the pot has increased. Now that your opponent is raising you and calling you. And you would want to check weak bluff catchers because those are not going to, now that they're going to be facing resistance, they're not going to be so great anymore as bets. So these are the principles you should keep in mind, in that you're going to be shifting one way or the other when you're playing against your opponents. So in the context of recalibrating your strategy to accommodate for people that are adjusting against you, there are just basically two things I need to do, or two ways you should react. Either you're going to shift to GTO to keep the money you made, or you're going to invert your exploit. That's it. And if you're thinking that this is very simple, it should be very simple, because the problem is not necessarily how to do it. A lot of times we're going to have problem on exactly how far we should take that exploit, not necessarily the principle, but how far we should go with it, which is what we're trying to get an intuition for here, but also when exactly to do it, right? So what is the exact moment that we're going to decide to change our approach? I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, which is deciding when is the exact moment appropriate to make the shift. And that's what we're going to discuss right now. Recall that, again, the two ways your opponents can get information on your strategy is through stats and showdowns. Okay, so your frequencies and your range composition. So when it comes to a circumstance where you and your opponent are in this fight for who can adjust better, the most important thing is for you to be extremely observant. Okay, I like this picture of the sky here. I think it conveys the importance of playing with your eyes open. In this, I cannot stress enough how this is important. And I have been coaching players for the last 5 years. And one thing I like to do with students is sweat sessions. So sweat is when the coach watches the student play. And in my case, what I like to do is I just watch a student play silent, completely silent. Some coaches like to, talk while the student is playing, even give advice. I don't like it. I like to watch a student play while silent. Then I take notes. And in the last few minutes of the session, I discuss the notes that I made. And I see constantly how often students miss spots or miss information that is being just handed to them. Stuff like, what was the bet size utilized? What was the action of the hand? Sometimes the student forgets what was the action of the hand during play. What were the timings of each action? What was the profile of that player? Sometimes the guy plays the entire hand and he still didn't profile the player. He still didn't realize whether it was a fish or a regular, or how tight was the fish, or how aggressive was the regular. There's sometimes no address of what is the profile the guy's playing against. So I would imagine a lot of you are also missing all of these informations that people are just given to you, but you're not taking it because you're not observant enough. So if you want to be a very good exploitative player, you have to play with your eyes open. You have to be as observant as you possibly can. Of course, you're going to have to spend more energy, particularly in the beginning when this hasn't become a habit for you. But it's totally going to pay off because the EV you can generate from observing all the information is much, much higher than whatever else you could be doing. So you need to be better than your opponent in the adjustment game. You need to adjust faster and need to adjust more accurately. One thing that I strongly recommend if you're going to play exploitative strategies, particularly in small pools, but also in maybe not so small pools, provided that you play a lot of volume, you should have in your HUD versus hero stats. So this is something that, for example, Hand to Know provides, and it provides automatically. For each stat you have in your HUD, Hand to Know calculates what is the versus hero stat. So if you want to say, for example, how often does this player fold to river bets? You can put that stat in your HUD. And then when you hover over that stat, you will also see how much has that guy folded against you on the river. So that's extremely important to keep track of metagame, to keep track of the exchanges you're making against specific players. You need to use this thing. And this is something I've been stressing for many years as well. And I guess it's something out of habit. I've been using Hand to Know for 6 years, and then I've seen my students stick with the other products like Hold'em Manager, Poker Tracker, which I guess all have their pros and cons, but the flexibility you can get with Hand to Know is insane. So I strongly recommend if you play in known pools with HUDs that you use the Hand to Know HUD. It has this versus hero stat that is automatically calculated for all stats, and you can quickly see how your opponents are reacting against you in particular. Okay, so this is going to be extremely important. So first thing, use versus hero stats. Another thing that I recommend, not that I recommend, that I think you must have for gaining for emerging victorious in the adjustment game, you need a tagging system. Okay, you need a system for quickly visualizing how is it that your opponents are currently perceiving you. That's extremely important because your strategy should be very aggressive. And if you play repeatedly against the same players, this is going to cause some of them to start reacting. And you need to keep track of those adjustments. And the way I prefer to do it is with the tag system. Okay, so I would say that you need at least 3 tags for each player profile. Perhaps you can have more for more specificity on how it is that you're currently being perceived. But I would say 3 is the minimum that you're going to need to do. So you're going to have one default tag for just that particular player profile. It's a regular, aggressive, regular, fish, tight fish, aggro fish, doesn't matter, but it's just a default tag without any adjustment consideration. And then you're going to have 2 more tags. One is for potentially adjusted or adjusting, whatever you call it, that you're going to use once you find evidence, and one for the people that you have absolute certainty that they are adjusting against you, that they're playing differently against you. You're going to have these 3 different tags. Okay. Now, in the second scenario, this is the most important scenario for us here. Okay, it's the second scenario because the first scenario is very easy. The guy, you're just tagging the guy, right? So you guys have no history. So you're just going to play against that guy as you would play against anyone else, which is with the incentives we saw here in the mentorship, very likely very exploitative. So the default is when you have no history. The adjusted is when you know for a fact that this guy is trying to adjust or is adjusting against you. You saw some outrageous showdown. You saw some crazy stats against you. You know for sure that this guy's adjusting. And here it's easy. You just apply the inverted exploit. Now it's the second scenario that we need to concern ourselves the most because it's a scenario where you have some evidence that the guy might be adjusting against you, but you still don't have 100% certainty. Right? You saw maybe 1-2 hands of evidence, 1-2 showdowns. You saw a stat that indicates that he might be adjusting, but could also be variance. This is the gray area where sometimes we're not sure yet what's going on, right? But we have some kind of indication that the guy could be potentially adjusting. Now, for these scenarios, what I recommend, if you really want to reduce the risk of playing exploitative strategies, and I'm always concerned with this because recall that there's a very significant disproportion between how much money you can make with the exploit and how much money you can lose if you're getting successfully countered. So we cannot afford to be wrong with our assessment too often. We cannot afford to be like, yeah, I think this guy is countering me, but I'm not sure yet. So I'm just going to keep playing the same way. And then you play 10 hands in a row against the same guy, and he is, in fact, adjusting. We cannot afford to be wrong in these circumstances because the amount we lose when we're getting countered is just much higher than what we win when we are successfully exploiting. So for these scenarios, I recommend what I call an insurance approach. Okay, I'm going to explain exactly what I mean with insurance approach. But with the name already, you have an idea of what I'm about to say here. Insurance is something that you pay to avoid a bigger risk, right? So if you pay health insurance, you pay a fixed amount every month so that in the event of something really bad happening, the insurance is going to cover your expenses. You're not going to have to pay out of pocket. So a similar idea happens here when we're in this gray area that the opponent might be adjusting, but we're not sure. We're going to do something to avoid losing this big amount of money if we are in fact getting exploited. Okay, so what is the insurance approach? You're going to mix opposing exploitative approaches at the same time. This is what the insurance approach is like. And the idea here is that you want to reduce the risk. Of course, the downside here is that you're reducing the reward if you're adjusting too soon, if you're over adjusting too soon. It's the same thing of thinking that, well, you're losing money paying insurance if you're never going to get sick and you're never going to go to the hospital. So you're basically, you could think of it as spending money in something that you would not otherwise have to spend. But the idea here is that we're reducing the risk, even though it might be that we're over adjusting too soon, the risk is so high that we do not want to go through that risk. So you're going to mix opposing exploitative approaches at the same time. What does that mean, Saul? Let's take a look at an example. Okay, let's go back to that bet check bet node. The bet check bet node, but versus big blind, same board. We have this GTO strategy here, and here you're going to have three scenarios. The first scenario, you're playing against someone who has a default tag. Someone who has a default tag is someone you're just tagging. Or maybe it's not someone you just tagged. You tag that guy, but then you have seen no signs of divergence in their strategy. No signs that they are somehow adjusting to how you're playing. In that scenario, of course, you're going to apply the population exploit. You're going to play according to your normal exploitative game plan. When you have found some evidence of divergence, this is a scenario where you gave that guy the potential tag, the potential adjustment tag. This is where you're going to use the insurance approach. And then once you have seen confirmed evidence that he is divergent, you give him the adjusted tag and you apply the inverted exploit. Okay, so those are the three scenarios. Either you're going to apply the population exploit because you have no reason not to do so, or you're going to use the insurance approach in the case that you suspect that you might be getting countered, or you're going to use the inverted exploit when you know for a fact that your opponent is deviating against you in particular. And why is it that we would want to use an insurance approach? It's going to be very clear in this following table. What we want to do here is reduce our risk. So in this exact scenario here of over bluffing in the bet check bet line, we know that the average behavior of the population is to overfold. If we overbluff and the guy overfolds, this is the EV of our strategy, 413 big blinds per 100. Now look at what happens when the guy overcalls. And this is considering a typical overcall, not the solver max exploit overcall against a strategy. When people overcall, they're typically going to do so in a much less extreme way than the solver. But then REV is certainly going to drop by a lot. Based on my model here, it drops to 355. And then if you are in the opposite scenario where you're thin value betting against that guy who's overcalling, you're back to making quite a lot of money, 419. But then if you're thin value betting against someone who's overfolding like you, if you decide to just go with the full adjustment, oh, I think this guy is overfolding against me, so now I'm just instantly going to shift towards a thin value betting strategy. But maybe you over adjusted and the guy is still overfolding. Now your EV drops to 373. But if you use an insurance approach, you can stay somewhere in the middle. You're not going to make as much money as in the ideal scenario, but perhaps it's impossible to stay in the ideal scenario because you still don't know how the guy is reacting. So if you mix the two approaches at the same time, you can achieve a better EV than either if you just stay doing the same and you're wrong, or if you shift completely and you're wrong. That's what we're trying to avoid here. We're trying to avoid a scenario where you shift completely based on the evidence and then you're wrong. So you're just like thin value betting against someone who's overfolding, or you're reluctant to adjust and you think, this is not sufficient evidence, I'm just going to keep playing the same way. But then the guy has in fact adjusted and you're just now losing a bunch of money. So you're going to use the insurance approach to secure at least an intermediate EV where you're not going to run the risk of getting exploited by that guy, okay? What's the difference between insurance approach and pseudo GTO? I haven't calculated the approach of the pseudo GTO. I prefer the insurance because it always keeps you at the mindset of exploitative strategies. I don't like shifting into a hit and run approach, as I call it, where I'm just going to shift back to GTO because someone is showing resistance. I like to always keep on the lookout for how can I exploit people. And I think the insurance approach allows you to stay in that mindset. You know, I'm going to, the very minute this guy gives me sufficient evidence, I'm going to play the max exploit strategy against him. But in this particular circumstance where I still don't have sufficient evidence, I will have a more sophisticated approach that is less risky by mixing the two approaches at the same time. But if you want to revert back to GTO, I think that's okay. Okay, so for this model that you guys are seeing the numbers here, I simulated a 50-50 approach. Okay, so 50% of the time, you're going to play against this guy the overbluffing strategy. 50% of the time, you're going to play the thin value strategy. And that's very easy to do. You just flip a coin or see the RNG on your screen. And if the number is from 0 to 50, you play the overbluff strategy. If the number is 51 to 100, you play the thin value bet strategy. And if you can do that, then you can achieve an intermediate EV against your opponent. As our friend PNA said here, you could also just revert to GTO, but I prefer to keep the exploitative attempts at all times. The only question about this, so it's a very simple thing. Once you know, of course, what we have been studying here, once we know what is the appropriate counter to the counter, right? That's what we have studied today. Once you know what's the counter to the counter, you have a very solid idea of how the principles change. Then you're always going to have these two modes of thinking in your brain. The main mode, which is for exploiting population tendencies, which is what you're going to use most of the time, but also already a preparation for what it is that you should do in the face of resistance, which is the counter to the counter. You're going to keep those things, both those things in mind at all times. And then once you see evidence of someone adjusting, you use the insurance approach. You give that guy a potentially adjusting tag, and you use an intermediate approach that is not going to run the risk of getting maximally countered, because we do not want to run that risk. And the only question you need to ask yourself here is how much insurance to use, right? What's the proportion of one extreme or the other extreme that you should use? And here there's no defined answer for this. You should always just keep in mind some very obvious points, which is that the better the player, the more insurance you should use, right? So sometimes what that means is that if you consider that player as very good, you make the adjustment towards the opposite strategy much quicker. So I've done this a lot in my career where I was maximally exploiting someone who I considered decent, but I still did because that node is just completely imbalanced, so I have to do it. But then once I see that the guy is showing signs of resistance, either I'm just going to use a lot of insurance right away, like 80% of the other extreme strategy and just 20% of the current, or just a complete shift all the way, because I know the guy is very good. And if he has in fact figured it out, then he is going to be making a decent adjustment. And then of course, the stronger the evidence, the more insurance you're going to want to use, right? And here you have to use good sense. You have to use your own judgment to say what constitutes as significant evidence or not. You have to think about, okay, what the stat that I'm seeing on my screen here means, or what is it that this showdown that I just saw means. This is very important. I think it makes sense. I like it. Keep the exploit mindset. Continue testing the technique. Exploits the villain might not counter. Exactly. That's the way to go, in my opinion. And this is what I would say is a very methodological approach for the adjustment game. You guys can see that I'm a very big nerd for systems and for processes and for being prepared. I think it's really important to be prepared. Like, what do I do in the circumstance? You cannot be in a situation where you're playing a competitive game and you're not prepared for what might happen. I think a lot of being a great competitive player in any game is being prepared for different game circumstances. So the one who has studied more different game circumstances beforehand is very likely to just come out on top. So this is just another system that you can use to be prepared for the adjustment game. If you're playing exploitative strategies and you're playing known pools, this is going to happen. People are going to react, but you shouldn't fear that as some sort of doomed circumstance. This is actually a good thing, because if you are better than those opponents at the adjustment game, you're going to make more money off of them than your initial exploits were making, because they're just making themselves more exploitable. So we see here how the thin value bet strategy against the overcalling guy is making more money, not so much, but is making more money than the overbluffing strategy against the overfolding guy. So when the guy puts himself out there trying to fight back against you, all you gotta do is to be better than them at that game. If you're equally capable at that game, you're just basically going to exchange money between each other. But if someone is better, and hopefully that's going to be you, you're going to be making more money than you were before. Right? So this is what I would say is a very good methodological approach for the adjustment game. Just recalling very quickly. For insurance approach, we use more thin value than GTO. Yeah, so the insurance approach is playing the two opposing exploitative strategies at the same time. Okay, I chose this specific scenario of the river bluff because it's the simpler one, but you can do the same thing in the delay c-bet example, right? So in the delay c-bet example here, so the insurance approach would be playing sometimes the max exploit strategy against population, which is just to check top pair plus and bet everything else for small size, and mix that with the counter, which is this. You bet top pair plus, and then you bet some of the thin value hands like jacks, tens, nines, and then you check the weak bluff catchers and check some of the air. So we're just going to be mixing the two approaches at the same time. Okay, so it's certainly more than GTO in a thin value sense. Insurance approach on slide with comparison EV is about constructing range with high amount of bluffs and high amount of thin value. Yeah, it's exactly these strategies that we saw here. Okay. These EVs are from exactly these strategies here. The thin value here that you see, which is the counter to the counter of the OP overcalling against our bet check bet. So we saw how if we overbluff, OP would start overcalling. Then we made a model for how population would typically do that, which is like 15-20% less fold than GTO. And then against someone playing like that, this is how solver would play. So this would be the thin value strategy. You would play against someone who's overcalling against you. And if you're going to play the insurance approach, you're going to mix this, like no bluffs, value betting, third pair or better, with the typical overbluffing strategy. Okay, you're just going to mix both strategies at the same time. Okay, so what is it that you want to do to always stay one step ahead? Okay, this is my blueprint for stay one step ahead. First thing is being more observant than your opponent. There's certainly a lot of edge to be had just by being more observant than your opponents. Because just like most of you, your opponents are also playing too many tables, playing distracted, not paying attention too much to HUD stats, not keeping the appropriate HUD stats in their HUDs, not paying attention too much to showdowns, not keeping track of history, not keeping track of showdowns, not keeping track of your timings. In fact, most people in poker are not as, I would say that based on my experience as a coach with the students that I've coached, people are typically like 50 to 60% as observant as they should be. The amount of information, I would say people drop half of the information that is available to them a lot of the time. So you just have to be more observant than other people. It's a very important thing. You can't be a good exploitative player if you're not observant. And then you have to recall that the way people can get information on you is by taking a look at your stats and your showdowns. That's it. That's how people get information on your strategy. Take a look at your frequencies, take a look at your range composition by looking at the hands you go to showdown with. So the same way that they are getting information on you through this, you get information on them through this. So you have to be extremely observant with your opponent's frequencies and your opponent's range compositions by the hands that you go showdown with. If you use hand to node and if you play against same players a lot, you can actually study their range composition off the tables. So studying your opponents off the table is also something really good. I think someone has asked about this in some of the prior classes. And I probably said that if you're playing in small pools and you're playing against same guys over and over, studying specific opponents is actually one of the best things you can do for your EV. Like you play against the same guy every single day. You're not going to study how that guy plays. Like, how does that make sense? Every single major competitive arena where people are playing against each other all the time, they're going to be studying each other's games. They're going to be watching videos of the other guy playing or reading about their strategy, or trying to come up with counter strategies. If you're playing against the same people every single day, you have to study their game. Okay, that's a very productive way of spending your time. So you're going to be observant, you're going to be paying attention to your opponent's frequencies and range compositions. Then you're going to use a tag system. You have to use a tag system to properly keep track of the adjustment game. Otherwise, you're just going to miss it. You're just going to forget it. You're just not going to be able to know exactly what stage of the adjustment game you are against each player. So you're going to have a default tag, a potentially adjusted tag, and adjusted tag. You have to have at least these three. I was browsing through Discord yesterday in the Discord server from my staking company, and it was unrelated to the mentorship, but I saw a post from one of my partners, Danielle, that we started studying together many years ago, and there was a print of his own tagging system. He had like 20 different tags. It was crazy when I saw that. I would typically limit myself to something like 10 different tags. He had like 20. He had like incorrectly adjusting, correctly adjusting, incorrectly adjusting, but still knit, and a bunch of different, more specific stages of the adjustment game. And I guess because he was always much more exploitative than me, even though I always considered myself very exploitative, he could be even more than me. And he had like 20 different tags. You should make your tag system as effective as possible for you. So this is something more personal. But at least you need these three. You need at least these three. Default, potentially adjusted, adjusted. When you have some idea that the guy might be adjusting against you, you need an insurance approach. And you need an insurance approach because recall that if the guy is in fact adjusting, you're going to lose more money than you were making when you were exploiting them. So you cannot afford to be wrong too often. That's why we're going to sometimes run the risk of over-adjusting too soon. It might be that the evidence that you saw, it's actually no evidence at all. It's just noise and you're over-adjusting. But we are going to run the risk of over-adjusting because not being quick enough in the adjustment game is going to cost us too much. So we will use the insurance approach whenever we have some evidence that this particular player might be playing differently against us. And the insurance approach is very simple. You're going to mix opposing exploitative approaches at the same time. You're going to be overbluffing and thin value betting at the same time. And the idea here is that you're going to reduce risk. And by doing this, we'll be able to keep the view of your strategy at an intermediate level where, of course, you're not making as much as the full exploit scenario, but that's probably impossible because we have already some evidence that the guy might be adjusting. But we're not going to run the risk of going to the very worst case scenario where we either are getting exploited, but we don't adjust, or we adjust fully to someone who is not adjusting against us, which would also be bad. So we're just going to play mixing. We're just going to mix opposing exploitative strategies at the same time. And you're going to keep on track of these three scenarios. And basically, every time you're playing against someone, you need to identify where in the adjustment game that guy is against you. If he's in a phase where you're just new to each other, or perhaps he has given you no evidence that he might be adjusting, you just keep applying the bullish and exploit. And you're going to be able to stay at the level 1 for a long time. Okay? Against non-observant players or incompetent players, you're going to stay at the phase 1 here for a very, very, very long time. If you're playing against competent and observant players, eventually you're going to go to phase 2, where the guy is seemingly adjusting against you, and you need to come up with a counter strategy. And at this period, where you're still not 100% sure, you're going to play the insurance strategy, and you're going to mix opposing exploitative strategies at the same time. And by the time you have absolute certainty that the guy has shifted, you start applying the inverted exploit. And then from here, what is it that can happen? Well, you're going to be applying. The guy thought that he was exploiting you by overcalling, and they just keep bombing thin value bets. You just keep bombing thin value bets. Keep bombing thin value bets. Eventually, that guy's going to be like, holy shit, I just keep running into a thin value bet, and I might as well start folding. So the guy's going to go back to phase 1, where he's just playing again as the population strategy. Okay, so if you can keep track of each phase, you can be much better at your opponents at the adjustment game. You don't have to fear the fact that someone's going to adjust against you. You should actually be happy about it, because you have lured those people into the battlefield, and you're going to be better at them at basically throwing punches, right? You just tease that guy until he came out of his cave. And now that he came out of his cave, you're much better at attacking their imbalances and keeping track of how is it that they're exploitable now. Are they now overfolding? So I apply the population exploit. Are they now overcalling? I'm going to apply the thin value bets. And I'm talking about this example because it's the simpler one. But recall that this is not just about river bets, okay? I just gave this example because it's the simplest one possible to give. But you should apply this principle in all of the different nodes where you feel you might be getting resistance from your opponents. So if you're playing the lazy bet node and you think that your max exploit of betting small with bad hands is getting countered because people are raising, you use the insurance here. And you start putting some nuts in there. You start putting some good hands in there. You start checking more. But then you mix the both approaches at the same time because you cannot be sure yet. If you stop completely playing the max exploit approach, and it is a circumstance where people are not adjusting as much as you thought, you're just leaving too much money at the table. But then if they have in fact adjusted and they're raising all of your probes and everything, but then you're just like, I don't want to adjust because I think that's not too much evidence, you're just going to lose a lot of money in the short term because we lose a lot by getting countered. So you want to mix both approaches until you have certainty of where it is that you're going to put your opponent into your tagging system. Once you have defined where they are in the tagging system, you just apply the appropriate strategy. Okay? So this is my process for you guys for always stay one step ahead. If you follow all these processes here, all this methodology here, all this system, I mean, it's really, really hard not to win a lot against your opponents. It's really, really hard not to crush basically anyone in your pools because you have all this data about how people are typically exploitable. Then you exploit the shit out of them. And then once they start to show some resistance, you already have all this plan on what you're going to do to fuck them up even more strongly. once they start showing resistance. So like not crushing people is really, really hard by applying this. Of course, always keep in mind that poker is a game where even if you're much, much better than the other guys, you still might come to periods where you're losing, still might come to periods where it feels like you're getting owned. So poker, I think the biggest difficulty about poker is that we always think we're worse than we are because of variance. Variance makes us think that we're worse than we are because we can be this amazing player that has a very high rate, but we're still going to go through periods of people owning us, of running our bluffs into their nuts, or running our nuts, not getting value from our nuts. So it's like it can be very hard to stay on track and stay confident in what you're doing because the feedback that we get is not necessarily correlated with how good we are or how good our strategies are. So that's probably the biggest challenge you have to face when applying exploitative strategies is to keep confident that what you're doing is good. That's the most difficult thing. All right. But if you can do this, I would say really, really low chance of not crushing everyone else. Now, to complement or to add on to the discussion that we had today, there's one more way that I like to, one more method that I like to stay one step ahead and to adjust against people in real games, which is a little bit more subjective than this one that we're talking about here, but if done correctly can be very effective, which is the concept of anticipation. I mentioned this in the Poker Made Simple week, which basically is the idea of recalibrating before any evidence is given to you. Okay, so you're going to adjust your exploitative strategy against someone even before they gave any evidence that they might be adjusting against you. The idea here is that you're going to use a lot of different variables to figure out where that particular opponent might deviate from the typical behavior of the population. Okay, we covered in weeks 2, 3, and a little bit of the 4th week how it is that population deviates from solver. That's the typical way that people deviate from solver. That's the aggregate. But sometimes you're going to have opponents, or sometimes you're going to have circumstances that cause people to behave in a way that is different from the aggregate. You should use anticipation to visualize and to realize where are these situations where your opponents might perform a behavior that is different from the data, different from the aggregate, and then you anticipate to that and you recalibrate even though you have never seen that guy play in a different way. It's just that specific circumstance, you can anticipate that they're going to behave in a different way, and then you recalibrate before having any evidence. So you're going to use your image, you're going to use your perceived range. Here, perceived range is extremely important. Your opponent's range composition and your opponent's specific tendencies to identify spots where people might behave a little bit differently from the aggregate of the data, and then you recalibrate before seeing any evidence. That's the topic of tomorrow's video that I'm going to release for you guys as a further enhancement of this process of staying one step ahead. Okay, guys, was today's class clear? I want to hear some feedback because I understand that a lot of this might feel a little bit too complex, maybe a little bit too abstract. Hopefully it will not be too abstract with tomorrow's video, and hopefully with my plan explain of Thursday. Okay, but was today's class clear enough? I really want to hear that from you guys. Chrissy says was the best class. That's awesome. Thanks, Chrissy. Solid, clear, very clear. Awesome, guys. That's awesome. That's great to hear. This is it then for today. Tomorrow we're going to have the anticipation video. On Wednesday, we're going to have our interview and Q&A with Dr. Luis Cipion. And then Thursday, we're going to have our plain explain demonstration. And on Friday, as usual, our Q&A. All right. Thanks everyone for today. I see you guys on Wednesday for our Q&A with Dr. Luis Cipion. Bye-bye, guys.